Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Our house is burning. This fact is becoming harder and harder to ignore or push aside. Look no further than the increasing frequency of natural disasters that are ravaging all regions of our planet. This crisis, however, did not unfold overnight. No, it did not. The truth is much more discouraging. We've been wreaking environmental havoc on the planet for years, and yet we as caretakers were always willing to shift our resources, time, and attention towards more pressing, self-induced catastrophes such as political saber-rattling activities, actual wars, or economic crisis. All the while, though, our planet and only home we've ever known was sending us its own warnings and messages about dire changes that were rapidly taking place. Most of us looked away. However, not all were oblivious to the peril we have been setting ourselves up for. There have been scientists and global experts that have been waving red flags for years, and it is only now that such warnings are finally being heard. Fortunately, we have one such climate crisis visionary on the program today who's been literally dedicating his professional and arguably personal life for years towards educating others on the dangers as well as actions we can take to head off this monumental crisis we all face. Svein Tveitdal is a Norwegian-based former director of UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, an environmental ambassador to the Norwegian city of Arendal. He is also the founder and CEO of Klima2020, an environmental consultancy based in Norway, which is centered on lecturing and advising businesses and local authorities that want to position themselves alongside and within this green shift that is beginning to take shape. His organization places a particular focus on bridging the gap between climate science, policymakers, and the general public. Svein has dedicated his life to educating the public about global warming and has been doing so before it was the chic thing to do, or arguably before it ever made its way onto the radar of the general public. His background, experiences, and professional engagement reads off much like a climate activist highlight reel. Make no mistake, though, all of this illustrates the passion, drive, and determination he has had towards doing his part to ensure that we as planetary caretakers are doing the right things to ensure a sustainable existence. Let me bring you up to speed on some of those said activities. Owner and CEO of the aforementioned consultancy, Klima2020. Former Assistant Executive Director, UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, where he was responsible for the Division for Policy Implementation and the Division for Environmental Conventions, including the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he was also the Polar Advisor to the Executive Director. Managing Director, UNEP Grid, a global resource information database, which the UN used to bridge the knowledge gap between climate scientists, policymakers, and the public. Svein set up the 5th Global Center for Grid in Arendal, Norway. Board Chairman and participation for the likes of the Norwegian Rainforest Foundation, Climate Point AS, Climate Compensation Fund, Purity IT, a green IT provider, the Energy Farm International Foundation, and Norfund, Norwegian Investment Fund for Developing Countries. And these are mere samplings of his board-level activities, with truthfully too many others to list. And currently, his present activities also include lecturing, writing, and participation in the public debate on global climate, where he has morphed into a true global social influencer on this issue. In fact, he's amassed a base of over 320,000 faithful and engaged Twitter followers who look to Svein for the most up-to-date and relevant social commentary covering the climate crisis. And finally, Svein has authored respected publications centered on this notion of raising awareness and spurring action towards tackling climate change issues. These publications include Climate in Peril, A Popular Guide to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Green Shift, a handbook for environmentally friendly regions in Europe. With all that stated, Svein, it's an absolute honor to welcome you to the show. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into this. I've had this circled on the calendar for a little while, and like I said, it's a true honor. So yeah. Why don't we just jump right into it, if that's okay? I have
go ahead.
Yeah, excellent. I have the first segment, something called Coloring Wikipedia, which is basically a segment where I'd like to bring listeners up to speed on what it is the guest does. And what I do here is I read off a definition of the guest profession as defined by Wikipedia. And another thing that sort of helps, I think, is it offers kind of this jumping off point to start the discussion. Sometimes these definitions underrepresent, what the actual work is all about. And other times they're spot on. So let me just read this off for you. And I will warn you here, it is a fairly general definition I've got for you, environmentalist, but within the context of your current past activities and experiences, perhaps afterwards you can comment. Sound good? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, here goes. Environmentalist. An environmentalist is a person who is concerned with and or advocates for the protection of the environment. An environmentalist can be considered a supporter of the goals of the environmental movement, a political and ethical movement that seeks to improve and protect the quality of the natural environment through changes to environmentally harmful human activities. The environmental movement contains a number of sub-communities that have developed with different approaches and philosophies in different parts of the world. Environmentalists can be described as one of the following: climate activists, conservationists, environmental defenders, greens, and water protectors. So there it is, Svein. What do you think about this definition from Wikipedia?
Well, maybe it is not so important what you call them, but I think what is important is that we have to welcome all groups or categories that would like to do something with the very tough situation we find ourselves in now, where the Secretary General in the UN is declaring code red for the world. I think we can take two approaches. Individuals need to do something, and the more they get educated, the more they do, the less they fly, the more they bike, the more they eat vegetable food, the better. But we also need to know that if a handful of us, or if 20 or 30 or 40% did that in a very, very correct way, it wouldn't keep us to the goal. Because what is needed, it is important and people should do it, but what is needed now to get out of the situation we are in is collective action. And for instance, here in Norway, there are more than 100 organizations that every day is trying to do something with the threat of climate change and also nature that is disappearing in a very fast way. Yeah. So when I'm out and talking to young people, I say that all of you can find an organization that fits with your interests, with your values, with your background. So what I'm telling them is, join such an organization. You don't necessarily need to be a climate activist, but if you do that, you do something that is important and needed to, in a way, speed up the green shift, which now we have maybe 10 years left to avoid climate catastrophe. So that is, in a way, my answer to that.
No, that's well stated. I think, sometimes we get caught up in these definitions and sometimes the formal nature of them. And it almost acts as like a wall for just everyday people that like say, well, that's not me. So that's not something that I necessarily need to worry about. But what you're saying here, of course, is that, yes, this is a job for all of us. And we don't need an official title, essentially, to be climate protectors, protectors of the earth, essentially, or people who care passionately about the climate issues. We don't need to get hung up on those points.
To follow up on that, it's a fact that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something.
Yeah.
That is my advice to the young people, and that would also be my comment to this kind of sequencing of these people that is trying to do something.
It was interesting. I was listening to another podcast actually recently, and they were speaking to some climate activists and world-renowned scientists. And the podcast itself was called Metaphysical Milkshake, and it was really interesting discussion. And one of the points that one of the hosts had raised regarding climate change, and one of the issues here, as you say, I agree, it's just we need people to get behind these issues. But there's this sort of sense of, I don't know, deniability, and there's kind of these three stages of it, essentially. I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, but one being like, well, climate change just isn't happening. And for the most part, probably there aren't too many people in that category anymore. Well, hopefully, I mean, there are still a few, obviously, here and there, but I think we're moving out of that stage, thankfully. And then there's another group here where it's just like, well, we don't need to worry about it. We don't need to make a mountain out of a molehill. There's like lots of obfuscation going on and just sort of like hiding some of these issues. And then I think that the third level, at least according to, to what this host had raised, is that there's a lot of people out there that just don't know what to do. Like, there's just like, what can I do about this problem? Like, me being this tiny little person on this planet, what can I do? And it's almost this, like, I don't know, giving up sort of.
No, but I often get that question, what can I do? Because I when I'm talking, and that's why I'm saying that what everybody can do is to join an organization that is in a way suitable for their values, for their background, for their interest. And if they go in there, first of all, they do something, they support something that is needed, a broad engagement, but then they also will learn more, because if they join such an organization, the organization itself will provide more information. And if you don't have the knowledge about something that is dangerous, you are not afraid of it, or you will not, in a way, be able to mobilize to do something with it. So knowledge is extremely important here. Mm-hmm. And knowledge is coming from media, of course, but it definitively from the schools, and also from engaging yourself in an organization that try to do something with the problem.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was leading up to with my point. Was I love your answer. Is just that, is get involved, attach yourself to an organization that reflects the values that you hold within. And from that, like you said, that's where your knowledge base is going to expand. And then hopefully, maybe even you can pass on that knowledge and that experience to others, and hopefully inspire action that way. And I think that's, quite frankly, that's the way forward that we need to start, moving towards. But no, thank you for that answer, Svein. It was really insightful. Would there be anything else you'd like to add to that? I mean, in terms of...
No, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, that would certainly take care of a lot of our troubles if we could get more people to think that way. I guess more on the personal side, in terms of what you do, I listed off, in your bio, essentially all these different activities, board level activities, and then, online social influencing, all these different things, on a day-to-day basis, what I don't know, what do you get up to? I mean, how would you structure your day or week around some of these issues? You've got the consultancy work with Klima2020.
Well, you mentioned that I was active on Twitter, and in the morning I normally spend an hour, 1.5 hours on getting through the international news related to both renewable energy, climate, and environment, nature. And then I post, say, 10 of the most interesting tweets related to those issues. So those that follow me on Twitter, then they will be updated on the latest news related to these important issues. So that's part of my day. Then very often I have a board meeting. I have learned that the good thing from COVID was that we have been much more efficient to use tools like Zoom as we do now. So I have most of my meetings on Zoom, even if there is no restrictions in Norway for doing whatever related to the pandemic anymore. So that has been an improvement. I just had a meeting with somebody Africa about funding. Interestingly enough, the first solar panel fabric on the African continent. So I'm that's one of the things I do. Then I have I spend quite a lot of time to teach young people. I go around to schools. Maybe we will talk a little bit more about it later on, but that is part of my daily work. And then I do some consulting. I still work with the municipality of Arendal related to environmental issues, and I also do some advice here and there. So all in all, I have a nice time, as I'm not retired, but I'm old enough to be retired, and of course I'm also a quite active member of the Grandparents Climate organization in Norway, working with all. I have 4 grandchildren. I spend time with them, and I also enjoy hiking and walking and stuff like that. So life is good for me, actually.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, and it's interesting how all those things tie together, right? And obviously you have the professional side, but the topic matter that we're discussing today, obviously climate change and some of these points, they tie in to future generations, your grandchildren, and all these different things that you certainly would not be lacking for motivation from a personal standpoint, but then obviously like in a holistic sort of level too, of course, humanistic level also. So no, thank you for sharing that. Well, I would like to move into a new segment, something called a Q&A discovery. Basically, we can kind of just continue this back and forth. And the first question is one that often comes up. I mean, a lot of listeners always want to know the backstory of, how this particular guest, got to this point in their career. So if we could, maybe we could rewind a little bit. I do understand from researching a little bit of your background that you started off as a surveyor for the Norwegian mapping authorities. Now, here's the question. Obviously, you've moved in towards, climate activism, and you've had a wonderful career, after your time with the mapping authorities. So was that shift towards climate activism, was it like a profound moment in your career, or was it something that just gradually took shape along the way?
Actually, it was, but let me go a little more backwards. Okay. Because I grew up on a small farm in Norway. We had 3 cows and a horse, and there was not so many neighbors, and it was 5 kilometers to the school, and the transport we had at that time, that was bike and horse. And so it's fantastic to talk to young people about that, because if somebody had asked me 65, 70 years ago about how the world would look like 70 years from now, and I had explained what it is, nobody would have believed me. This is the science fiction. So the development has gone so very fast. But in that situation, I was a lot in the nature. I did fishing, and at that time we nobody had heard, of course, about climate change, and the nature that was around it, that I also fell in love with, was something that was there, and there was no thoughts or ideas that this could be jeopardized, that we could it would disappear in the future. So it was a very safe and fine. We were not rich, we were not poor, but it was a fantastic kind of way of and then why did I become a surveyor? Well, I love the nature, so it was a good idea to go out there and make triangulations and measure the world. And then there was a technology shift, and I started using when I then started working with survey department and others. Then at that time, the GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and Environmental Information Systems were coming, and where I worked, we were good at that. But then the real shift came, and this is the background. When Mrs. Brundtland, our Prime Minister at the time, launched the report on environment and development, or the Brundtland report, that was in 1979. And I read that report, and since then I have actually been working with nature, environment, climate every day. And in that report it was said that this grid system that was there, you mentioned I established the 5th center in Norway, that was a recommendation. And then I was then setting up that center, and which in this case was with a focus on communicating scientific, solid information to the public and to decision makers. And in a way, that is what I've been doing since in very many positions. So definitively there was an absolute shift when I read that report and took that action. So since then I have been working on those issues.
Okay. It's interesting how you can kind of trace things back to one particular moment, in essence, really shifting the course of your career. Do you recall in like any great detail what, like, was there anything in particular that still stands out to you now that would be even relevant to today from that report?
Well, it was the principle is definitely the same. It is about sustainable development, and there was a focus on of course climate and also on nature in that report, and that we needed to really take care of all these issues and not just business development, to have a sustainable world in the future for our children and grandchildren. And this was the first time that this was in a way really coming up on the global agenda.
That's interesting how you really internalized that and took it to a different level. I mean, right now,
obviously, because there was a clear recommendation on this grid center, the importance about in a way presenting scientific knowledge in an understandable form, and that was the whole idea. And then it grew. So there's now in the center here now, there are more than 50 employees. It's still going. I left it many years ago, but it's very good. And I was also setting up centers in Poland and even in Georgia and some other places. So that was an important period.
Yeah. I guess looking back now would be both somewhat rewarding, but then also a bit frustrating as well, I would assume, just based on like what you've just explained there. I mean, 1979, I guess these issues being raised and of critical importance. And these are the same probably issues that you just said are being raised over and over again. Great scientific data, lots of information, studies behind it. And yet we're still putting out the same things and struggling at times to really move that agenda forward.
The sad thing is that, the good thing is that we know much more now than we knew 30 years ago. But the sad thing is that we are not listening to the advice and recommendations from the scientists. So the gap between what is needed and what we do is bigger today than it was 30 years ago. And if we had listened to the scientists 30 years ago, we wouldn't have been in the really deep shit that we are in now. That's the fact, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that's a really nice segue into my next question, actually, which is, again, I understand from researching, a lot of your tireless efforts working for the UN and, what you were just explaining, setting up these systems, basically, where a lot of this critical information could be analyzed, studied, processed, and ultimately passed on to stakeholders such as governments and policymakers. And of course, that could be, and I'm sure it was rewarding at times, but also you grew frustrated by a lot of this due to a lot of the inaction being taken. And you have these UN stated recommendations. This is what we need to do. And then it just being fluffed off by governments at times. And there was some frustration there from at least what I was researching in your past. And maybe you could speak to that point a little bit.
Yeah, I can. Of course, that has been many disappointments. As I said, we have not listened to the scientists.
Yeah.
And to comment a little bit on the UN, I remember in the last meeting I participated in Nairobi when Kofi Annan was there. Mm-hmm. He was the former Secretary General of the UN. And it was just before he stepped down as a Secretary General. He, in a way, apologized that the UN had not been able to produce a climate policy according to what the UN's experts and scientists recommended. And that is the problem and the challenge, because UN cannot do more than the countries in a way allow them to do. So and that has been too little. And if you listen to what the Secretary General says today, he's much more dramatic in his in a way warnings to the world that and Kofi Annan was at that time. But on the other hand, to comment on that, I think the way forward is we need to follow the UN track, because, you know, if the politicians, and there is a movement now, if they are willing to really do something with the problem, we have the framework, we have the measurements, we have the reporting, we have everything in the Paris Agreement and in the convention. So I think the only way we have to proceed is to follow the UN track. But of course, in addition to that, it's extremely important that business and municipalities and national governments and other groups is delivering, because the UN can do something with it, and they can do more if they're allowed to do, and they're willing to do more. They have the tools and means, but they are also dependent on an engagement from the civil society, from municipalities, from cities, from and not
from individuals, right? Just individuals, like how we started this conversation. People getting engaged with these matters and taking a bit of responsibility for themselves and their own actions, right? I mean, that plays into it just as much as well, I would say. Here's a quick question to follow up on that. So, you know, some of the things you were just referencing were back in the 90s, back in the 1990s, and some of these governments just fluffing it off then. And obviously that's been occurring for quite some time. But do you think there has been any progress? Do you think things are getting a little better in terms of that, in terms of some governments being willing to take on these issues more and not just, you know, having these wonderful speeches with little action or follow through? Are you, as someone who is completely plugged into it, do you think we're making progress in that sense, or not a lot still?
Yeah, we do, but too little and too late. And it's but there is something is happening. You know, the knowledge about climate and what is happening is becoming clearer and clearer for every year. But we knew already 30 years ago about what is happening, and what is happening today is more or less what has been predicted. But I go to my own when I'm doing a lot of presentations, and when I started doing the school programs 5 years ago, I basically said the same thing as I say today. And some people then said that I was I was preaching doomsday. But then, if you listen to what Biden, to what Macron, to what Johnson said on the last climate summit in Glasgow in November, if I had said the same thing 5 years ago, as I said, then I would have been accused for being a preach for doomsday. So they are getting more afraid, and they know that, as you started to say, that the house is burning. So and this is something that has changed over the last 2-3 years. So yes, there is a difference, but still it goes too late, and it's not it's not strong enough, and we are still going towards a climate catastrophe, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's code red, right? It's blaring, and you're right. I mean, there's a lot of progress, and there is a lot of encouraging, movements taking place, but yeah, that red light is still flashing brightly, I would say. Yeah, I completely agree. That's the impression that I'm getting as well, unfortunately. Here's a bit of a creative question, I suppose. I mean, concerning this point, I think scientists have been doing this forever, right? And putting out these reports, giving us statistics constantly. And it feels like, ostensibly, we're getting new reports on a weekly basis. Maybe not that often, but it feels that way, which is a good thing, ultimately. But if you could magically sort of implant like 2 or 3 statistics into the brains of every single human on this planet, regarding or relating to this climate crisis, what would you say? What would be these stats that every single person should know?
Well,
top mind awareness.
let me try with fever. You know that the warming has been approximately 1.1 degree, the global warming, on since the pre-industrial time.
Yeah.
And if you compare that with fever, we have 38 in fever, and that is okay. We live well with that. So maybe people think that every degree in the future will be like that. But then, as it looks now, we are approaching at least 2 degrees. And that means that if everybody, at least we are going further, but say that we are passing 2 degrees, which we most likely will do, then we have 39 in fever. And what the scientist is saying now is that if we do business as it looks like now, as the governments are reporting back to the climate convention, we are going ahead 3 degrees. So that means that we have 40 in fever, and we are going towards 41 because 4 degrees. So this is the trouble we have. And I don't think people really understand that the warmer it gets, we can use this fever example on what is really
nice metaphor for it. Yeah.
So the planet has fever, and it looks like it almost deadly the way we go now.
Yeah. With those numbers, I've never heard that before, but it's really poignant, I think, and it brings it down to a level where so that anybody can understand.
But the figures are like this. If we are going to stop the warming on 1.5 degree, like what the is the recommendation, and they even the state heads of state agreed on that in Glasgow. We need to reduce the emissions 50% on the next 8 years. It will not happen. If we are going to stop on 2 degrees, we have to reduce quite a lot, and that is still possible. But if we don't do what we do today, if we put together the pledges that the governments has given to the convention last in Glasgow, we will pass 2.5 degrees and approach 3 degrees. And when we now, in a way, analyze the status in the countries, they don't follow the pledges that is voluntary. So we are on a way to between 3 and 4 degrees, and that is between 40 and 41 in fever. That is exactly how it is.
Yeah. We're not functioning at that level. Like, like that. That's what I like about this metaphor. I mean, it strikes home. It hits hard and it hits fast. I mean, no humans obviously functioning at that level. The planet, we can't expect the planet to be functioning at that level either, right? I mean, if we're putting it into those terms, it's very plain and it's very clear. I really like that. I think that's it's a nice way of making it real. I think at the moment, people are being bombarded by all these statistics, which are impactful, should be impactful, but maybe just the number of them that are coming out of people are just brushing them aside. Well, I've heard this before, but something like that metaphor, I think, speaks to, it hits differently, is guess what I'm trying to say. Okay, no, thank you for sharing that. I do have another question here, and this one, maybe it's a point I'm trying to make, is that I find, at least in my sort of consumption of information and data and all these things surrounding climate change, the focus oftentimes, and for good reason, of course, is centered on the impacts on us, on humans, on our way of life, on our precious habits, our precious, ways of life and living. And obviously, I mean, it makes sense, makes sense. But I also find this a little bit reprehensible, and I would venture that you would too, because it's not just about us. Obviously, there's biodiversity, it's the earth, it's, the plants and the animals, it's all these other things that are being affected. And of course, it all ties in to one another. But there's a point of frustration I find, at least for myself, is that it's always centered on us. And I think that's part of the problem of why we're in this place, or we have this issue in the first place. Somehow, some way along the line, we've become detached, or we put ourselves up on this pedestal above everyone else, being the dominant species here on this planet. And we've put ourselves in this position that we're here to rule over everything else. And I would venture to guess that, say, like indigenous groups, for example, on the other hand, had a different sort of connection, a view of ecology, more in the sense that they were interconnected in this web, essentially, of life and living and ecology. And, they had a special communion with all of that. And I think a lot of those communities have done well. I mean, they're small, obviously, in minorities groups in a lot of countries, but they've done well with their ecology. But it's been a lot of the rest of us that have kind of messed things up in our ways of thinking. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is that this is a big part of it as well. It's not just these economic issues or economic models that are at fault. I think there's something greater, something deeper than that. And I would be curious to hear what you think about something like that.
Oh, but the nature crisis is as severe and as dangerous as the climate crisis.
Yeah, it's all tied in,
right? What we are doing today, directly or through global warming, is to, in a way, reduce nature in a way that, in a speed that we have not seen in millions of years.
Yeah.
Scientists talk about the sixth mass extinction. The last one was I think it was 63 million years ago in Mexico, when a meteor, in a way, dumped down there, and the dinosaurs was extinct. But people are not aware of how fast this is going. And I mentioned when I was born 70 years ago, everything was fine. And now, things, every year we put an area like Great Britain under asphalt and cement, and through what we do. But also climate change is, in a way, slowly or no more in speed contributing. A couple of examples. Maybe the most severe thing is that if when we come to 3 degrees, as I talked about, is possible, then many scientists say that we will the rainforest will not survive. So the rainforest in Brazil, Amazon, will be gone. It will be a savanna, and the same maybe in Congo and in Indonesia. So, and without a rainforest on the world, we will probably not survive as humans. So, and when I talk to young people, I explain to them, maybe they are not aware, but everything you eat, everything you wear, everything you in your studio there, everything that is around you, everything is in a way or another coming from the nature. and now there is not so much less. And instead of taking care of it, we are killing it. And that we do parallel with not stopping the climate change, and also with putting in new infrastructure and everything. So this is a very, very complicated thing. We have to have both those thoughts in the head at once, and we have to solve both the issues. It is still possible if we listen to scientists, but the time squeeze is getting more and more severe and complicated, and it's getting more expensive. So the next generation and the generation after that, they are really, in a way, facing some very, very serious problems. There is no doubt about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like I said, I really think, I mean, it's these two things, you know, it's these economic models and policies and ways that we sort of, you know, place ourselves within the environment. I think it's that mind shift and change. And I think like maybe that's what you're alluding to there in terms of the youth coming through and having a different mindset. You know, maybe us not necessarily being the rulers of this planet, but being part of it, you know, not being the ones who are making all the decisions and controlling it, but you know, we are tied into it, like I said, this web essentially. And it's that I think that we have to start shifting more towards. And there's a lot of, obviously there's economic benefits to doing things that way as well, but we've been stuck on this other side of, like you're speaking of, infrastructure, you know, chopping this down to build this up, which is going to make our life more convenient, or this or that. And it's
I
that.
can make another point there that is similar to what the UN and the world is doing on climate change, because the UN and the have decided that we have to solve this problem. We need to protect 30% of land and sea. And if we do that, then nature comes back and can support us in the future. And this should be done before 2030. Another thing that they have agreed upon in the Nature Convention is that we need to restore nature that has been destroyed. And they have decided that we need to rewild or restore 15% of the area that has been destroyed within 2025. And we are not doing that as well. So this is, we have the Climate Convention, we have the Nature Convention, we have got a nature panel. And in the same way as with climate, politicians are not listening to advice from scientists when it comes to nature, and that nature is disappearing, and that we have the sixth mass extinction. And these things is closely related, because it's impossible to solve the climate crisis without a robust, solid, and fresh nature. So again, the challenges are just increasing around us.
Yeah. I'd venture to say that most of our talk to this point, you know, 35 minutes in here, has been a lot of doom and gloom, and rightfully so. I mean, we can't avoid a lot of what's going on, and we can't, you know, hide from these facts or details. But also at the same time, I've also read that, you know, part of these doom and gloom sort of like, you know, prognostications are good in a sense. I mean, they are good in a sense that it shows us exactly what we need to do. You know, and maybe what hasn't been working, and it offers, you know, maybe hope in that sense of, okay, well, it offers a roadmap of, okay, this is the problem here. We need to address this. So you can take it that way, I suppose, too. And I guess this would be a nice segue to return to something that you brought up earlier, which is your involvement with youth. And I think that inherently sort of offers a degree of optimism. And maybe you could speak a little bit more to that, of what you've been doing.
Yeah, I would really like to do that, because over the last 4 or 5 years, I have been around in Norway on, I think, 200 schools, and we have met 25,000 students, young students.
Wow.
Yeah. And we have a kind of presentation called Hope or Catastrophe. And we are going towards a catastrophe, but there is hope and there are solutions. And here we are coming to the green shift and so forth. But one thing that I really tell the young people, and I love to do that, is that they have been more important than they are aware of over the last 3 or 4 years. I tell the young people about Greta Thunberg that when she was 15, she's now approaching 19. We are sitting outside the parliament in Sweden with a pamphlet every Friday saying that I'm going to sit here every Friday until you have decided on a policy inside the parliament that gives me and my fellow students a safe life in the future. And then, in the meantime and up to now, and despite in a way the pandemic, she got millions of young people with her around the almost every country. So I can tell them that if they hadn't done this big effort, the world would have been much farther away from reaching a solution. But now, when these world leaders finally, as I said, talk more dramatically about what is happening, you know what they use as an argument in the big conferences? They talk about what the young people have been doing over the last 3 years. So I'm also telling them I'm asking them, if anybody in this class or in this audience, there are often many students, if anybody of you have participated in this, I say a warm thank you, because then you have really contributed to do something with a very dangerous situation, and you have supported your other in the young generation. So that is I like very much to do that, because it is in a way explaining that they don't have so much money, they don't have, definitively they don't vote yet, but still they have actually contributed a lot to do something which is needed to change the pace in the development that we see now.
Yeah.
And they are receptive, and we have discussions after we have had our lecture, and they even now when I start, I ask them about how many of you are worried about this, what is happening to the nature, that is disappearing fast, and the globe, the world is getting warmer, and that varies. But say when we started some years ago, it was fewer, and now it's up to, it's say between 50 and 80% that is worried in that little poll. Then of course also I'm talking to the schools, because then I say to the teachers that you know that in Norway, according to what the teachers should teach in these issues, sustainable development should be in any curriculum, and now we have been on 200 schools, and we can see that this is treated very differently from school to school. So my recommendation goes to the teachers that you have to do more here, because if maybe those people that didn't raise their hand, the reason for that was that they didn't know too much about it, and that if they don't know anything about it, why should they worry?
Yeah, well said.
So there is great hope here in the young people.
Yeah, I think so. I had maybe a month or so back, I had a climate technology based guest who came on, and we were talking about a similar topic about youth, and she had said something along the lines of, what's encouraging to her at least is that, if you were to stop a 7 or 8 year old on the street right now and ask him or her, about this problem, climate crisis, or what are some of the issues here that we're facing, probably most of them would be able to tell you something about it, maybe on a rudimentary level, but they would have a certain level of awareness, at least, even at a young age as that, 7 or 8 years old. Whereas, say, somebody in my generation or your generation, obviously that was not on our radar one bit, not at all, I would say. And that, to me, something as simple as that gives me hope. And to your point as well of, some of these movements with youth, what I find encouraging is that they call out some of these leaders. They're not afraid to stand up, or even, their parents for some of their actions. And I think there is a power associated with that. And we've been lucky to have some pretty great role models within, these youth movements that have made these things okay to do, in essence. So yeah, there is some, some positive developments here going on. Maybe we could shift over into another segment here, something called a water cooler story. And this is a segment basically where I just ask guests to indulge listeners with a story relating to the topic of discussion. So yeah, I'm really eager to hear what you have for us, Svein.
Yeah, well, I just heard about it, but what dropped out of my head immediately was that if we go back to the moment when I really knew that we had to do something and started to use technology to communicate environmental information, that when I read the Brundtland report, then I would go back to the meeting in the Rio meeting with on environment and development in 1992, because then I had been working in this for 2-3 years. And in Rio, everybody, all countries came in with a big with a state of the environment report. So it comes in tons and tons and tons and tons of paper. But in the meantime, in the new grid center where we worked with the UN, we came to Rio with 4 diskettes instead of tons and tons and tons of paper. So we were able to present the first digital State of the Environment report at that summit in Rio. And at that time, that was a big thing. We had a big launch with the Prime Minister and others, so it was
Wow.
it was fantastic. And we followed up a few years later with launching the first State of the Environment report on internet, where our Minister of the Environment did launch it. So it was interesting to use technology to try to, in a way, implement the mission about bridging the gap between scientists and the public, and not the least the decision makers. So that was one issue. I have had so many in my life, but at least I still remember that very well, as it would have been yesterday. And that was back in 1992, and it was just 2-3 years since I, in a way, started working with these important issues.
Must be interesting in the sense that, say within your consultancy and noticing a lot of the technological change and development that's come along, that being a perfect example back in 92, and how that was probably a game changer in a lot of respects. But now, say within this whole climate tech industry as well, and all the change that's happening there. And again, I think that would probably be something that we could, have a degree of hope towards. I mean, tech alone isn't going to solve the problems, but there is something to it that I think it's part of the solution, at least. And you probably witnessed a lot of change along those lines as well. Maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, but we have also, yes, it is much more easy to share information. We have this meeting today. We're sitting here. You're in Japan. I'm in Norway. Yeah. These things work very nicely, and updated, solid information is much easier available at any time. But there is some backsides also so because you have there has been issues with fake news so these things can also be used for things like that. And when I again go back to my schools, we often get questions about, yes, but I've seen on the internet that an EV is not better than a petrol car, and blah 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 blah. So that is, and of course that goes broader than climate and biodiversity. It goes in a way to the tops of the politics and elections and everything. So as I said, there is a dramatic change in the world. And another thing I talked about when I was on the small farm here and had a horse. I didn't have, but my my parents and grandparents had 3 cows and a horse, and then here are we today, and I talk to the young people about this has gone extremely fast. But if I should say something to the young people about what would the world look like another 70 years from now, that is absolutely impossible. I don't think we even can say what is the world in 30 years. So that, but we need to use the knowledge we have, at least to make the platform to survive as good as possible. And then we have to do something with the climate crisis and the nature crisis, because if we don't do that, then it will in a way be another world. A world without rainforests is everybody would know that is very complicated.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I'd like to, if we could, maybe return to this point of technology. And you just outlined some of the dangers with it. Yeah, some of the great things with it, but then also some of the dangers. In terms of, I guess, some of the more positive sides to it, to a degree here, we have economic models that are kind of taking shape, cyclical economies, regenerative philosophies. On this program, for example, next week I'm having a guest from a venture capital firm that's focused on early stage climate tech companies that have these visions and models of going out there and trying to affect positive change. So there's an economic model attached to it, but then there's also something, fulfilling about it as well. And I think this is part of the solution. Of course, we need this, and it's going to be something we're going to have to rely on to a degree. But also at the same time, I think it's one of those things too that we can't, hitch our wagons to completely. And as I said earlier, there has to be something more to all of this as well, I would say, an ideological shift, if you will. And maybe you could comment to that. I mean, some of the things that you've seen, technologically speaking, but then again, returning to this point of, how are we going to marry all of these ideals together? And is it possible? Can we even do this from your experience and your insights? What do you think?
Well, I have always been a technology optimist, and there is no way we can solve these crises without technology. I'm myself in some of the companies where I'm a member or board chair. We are working on the green shift, and of course that is in a way the future for business. So yes, this is good, this is needed, and that should be promoted. But there is another issue that we haven't talked about, and that is maybe also a little bit complicated, necessarily not to do with technology, but with the green shift. That UN is saying that we need to reduce emissions by 50% within 10 years. But they are also saying, and for environmentalists, maybe that is more difficult. And it's related to what we just discussed. We need to triple the production of renewable energy in the same period, because if we don't do that, the fossil industry will still boom. And if we then triple, we have offshore wind, we have solar, we have hydro, we have nuclear. But if we don't do this, then we're not coming out of this crisis. And if we do it, we will, in a way, crack some eggs. So we need to also, at the same time as we are speeding up renewable energy, we need to protect the nature. And there is a contradiction. So I'm working quite a lot with ideas on how those who is, in a way, destroying nature can restore and rewild. And that is something that and a company today, we are building actually a car battery fabric in Arendal, and I'm working with the fabric with the municipality, that they need to and they want to position themselves amongst 30 other battery fabrics in Europe that I want to be. They are now in China and Korea and your part of the world, but they want to position themselves as the most sustainable battery fabrics in the world. And then they need to do something with the nature. So this will be more and more important for business, that if you do something wrong with the nature, you have to restore it. So that is also quite high on my agenda, that this is needed, because we need the batteries, we need the hydro, we need the renewable energy production, but we also need to protect the nature. So, and we have answers from scientists, but again, this picture is getting more and more complicated the more we dig ourselves down before we do the solutions. So yes, I am a technology optimist, and your question is, in a way, you cannot go ahead without being an optimist. That is what you have to work with all the time. So, and if you ask a scientist today, is it possible to in a way, limit global warming to 1.5 centigrades? They say yes. If you ask them, will it happen? 95% is saying no. And why are they saying no? They are saying no because they have experienced that politicians are not listening to what they recommend or say is necessary. So we have to be better here. We have to and I think the time will come when so I don't think that the world will go under. I think the time will come, but the point is that it will come so late that it will be extremely expensive to do something with it. We found the money when we had the pandemic, COVID. So if we did the same effort, we could stop the climate and nature crisis. We just don't do it, but it is possible.
No, I appreciate that insight. I mean, I think what you've shared today has been, a hefty dose of reality, obviously, which is what, we certainly need. We need to have these discussions. We need to fully understand the consequences of our actions. But then also, too, I mean, as you said, I mean, we can't not do that without also looking towards things in an optimistic manner and having hope, right? So I think that was it was well said, and I would guess well received, or will be well received by a lot of listeners to this program. And I know for myself, I certainly took it that way. I think, sorry.
Yeah, there is one. I think there is another issue I need to mention, which is extremely important, because the reason why we are where we are is the immense lobbying force and influence from the fossil industry. And the thing is that every minute the fossil industry is subsidized with something like $10 million. And it is subsidized much, much more than the green shift and the renewable energy. So if we took away the subsidies and put it into incentives for the green shift, we would solve most of the problems quite immediately. If we stopped deforestation, which is contributing with 20% to the annual emissions, we would reduce emissions immediately with 20%, and we would save the rainforest. So this immense lobbying and force from the fossil industry is the main problem and the main hindrance for getting into a kind of sustainable future. It is, if it wasn't for that, the politicians would do the other way around. So this is what we need to do. Stop subsidizing fossil industry, give incentives to the green shift and production of renewable energy, and stop deforestation. Yeah. It's possible to do it, but it is not done by individuals. It is not done by the market. We need policy, because if we had time, we could just leave this to the market, and in 50 years, everything would be electric. But we don't have the time to do it, and then
Really good point.
that's so important that the focus has to be on reducing the power and impact of the fossil industry and stop subsidizing.
Well, I think that was something that a lot of people were really curious to see. I mean, I'm going to be, dating this podcast instantly by bringing this up, but we're May right now, and the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, what's been going on there. A lot of people were saying, well, this is obviously is unfortunate and tragic and all these terrible things, emotions attached to this. In terms of the climate crisis issue, this could be almost a litmus test for a lot of nations, for a lot of policymakers, governments, to really put their foot down and say, like, no, this is the chance for us to really start investing in just what you were speaking about, getting away from coal, not being as reliant on, say, a country like Russia, and really, like, here's our opportunity to really start shifting more towards green energy solutions, or more, sustainable solutions, wind power, wind, solar, and so on. And, to be honest, I remember thinking a couple of months back, like, yeah, I agree. This is the opportunity. This is our litmus test. And as I've been following along, I've seen some encouraging news, but then also it's been kind of balanced out by things that haven't been as encouraging, where, different places within Europe or in North America are starting new coal plants of their own to offset,
you can that is correct. But think about
there have been other positive developments as well.
If we had started up renewable energy production some years before, we wouldn't have been dependent on coal and oil and gas from Russia, in connection with the Ukrainian war, and we would have been in a much better position. So this is another thing and another learning. But now there is more, in a way, push on the green shift and renewable energy because of the war, but there is also this increased kind of impact or request for more oil, gas, and coal that makes the fossil industry boom, and again has the result that there is not the necessary progress in producing new renewable energy. So the picture is complicated, but the Ukrainian war should be used to the better when it comes to the green shift.
Well, again, Svein, I've truly enjoyed all this conversation, and quite frankly, I could probably go for another hour, but I am conscious of your time, and I've really appreciated all of your insights, all of your commentary on all of this, and I'm sure, as I said earlier, listeners will have really appreciated all of this by the time they've listened to this full episode. So yeah, I thank you immensely for taking the time and joining the program today. Yeah. For those interested in learning more about Svein and his work, you can find him on Twitter and join the hundreds of thousands of other followers who benefit from both the sobering commentary as well as the encouraging developments relating to the environment. And he can be found under the handle at TVEITDAL. And also you can check out his company, Klima2020. And for reference, all of this information will be included in the show notes. And if you like today's show, please be sure to share. I mean, I think, the more we can kind of learn about one another, the stresses, the joys, the pressures, all of these things, it helps enhance empathy. And I think if we have that, it kind of reduces that divide amongst all of us. And hey, I mean, that's never going to be a bad thing. You can also rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts, and head on over to YouTube. I recently launched a channel over there, Life as a, where you can catch full video episodes of our conversations, much like we had today. And the interesting thing is we have a slideshow off the top with imagery associated with the episode. So you can kind of take your level of understanding and enjoyment perhaps to a different level by going over there. And if you do, please be sure to hit subscribe. It is a new channel. We could use a bit of love over there. So yeah, I'd really appreciate that. And then finally, don't forget to tune in to the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.